Welcome to This Old Democracy, a regular podcast where we explore the ideas, movements, and people working to rescue our faltering political system and rebuild American democracy on a stronger, more inclusive, and truly representative foundation. I'm your host, Micah Sifry, and I've been toiling in these fields for a long time, from taking on the problem of money in politics, to writing a book about third parties, to tracking how the internet keeps shaking up the system, and more recently, joining the fight against rising authoritarianism. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Center for Ballot Freedom, a cross-partisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy. Today, we're talking with Ian Bassin, the co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. Ian previously served as Associate White House Counsel under President Obama, where he worked to ensure that executive branch officials complied with the laws, rules, and norms that protect the fundamentally democratic nature of our government. His writing on democracy, authoritarianism, and American law and politics has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and other publications. A recipient of a 2023 MacArthur Fellowship and the Skoll Award for Social Innovation, Ian received his JD from Yale Law School and a BA from Wesleyan University. Ian, welcome to This Old Democracy.
Thanks, Mika. It's good to be here.
Well, it's really appreciate you taking the time to join us. To start out, would you tell us a little bit about your organization, Protect Democracy, that you started in 2017? What does it do? How, not a lot of people know about it. So how do you go about your work?
Well, you mentioned in that very kind introduction that I had spent time in the White House counsel's office trying to make sure that people follow the rules, which is sort of a quaint idea these days, but it has mattered, and it's mattered for, most of the history of this country, and it's mattered whether the president was a Democrat or whether the president was a Republican. These rules are nonpartisan. These rules are to make sure, for example, that the federal government doesn't interfere in our elections to rig them to keep the person in power in that position, or, for example, that the president of the White House doesn't reach out to the Department of Justice and tell them who to investigate or who to prosecute. For a time, that was kind of a shared value in this country. And so fast forward to the election of 2016, someone was elected in this country who I would argue is really neither Democrat nor Republican, but sort of situates on a different spectrum, the spectrum between small d democracy and authoritarianism, which is a different spectrum globally and in history. And in that moment, a lot of us who had worked in government, making sure that our system remained democratic, we're concerned about how do we make sure that it stays that way with someone ascending to power who takes the oath of office with his fingers crossed behind his back, not fundamentally committed to the constitutional vision that the founders laid out. And so we launched Protect Democracy out of a recognition that what was happening here had been happening around the world in the 21st century. We've seen autocrats rise from the left in Venezuela, from the right in Hungary, and had reached American shores by 2016. And so we built an organization to prevent the autocratic playbook from manifesting here in the United States by doing four things, essentially. First, the most foundational aspect of a democratic system is that the people are sovereign and the people get to vote at regular intervals for who should represent them, and that those elections are free and fair and fully informed. And so the first thing we do is we work to protect the integrity of American elections against efforts to subvert them. Now, of course, the mechanics of elections is one piece of that, but the other piece of that is making sure that people can actually engage in a healthy democratic debate, that the public square is free and open, that people don't get, for example, investigated or prosecuted because of an opinion they espouse or a group they associate with or a party they belong to. So a second piece of that is really making sure that the public square is healthy and people can get accurate information and robustly debate about public matters. The third thing is that once we do elect people, we don't just give them all power to do whatever it is they want, as some people have recently said, but we expect them to operate within certain constraints, the rule of law, checks and balances, the separation of powers, the protection of constitutional rights. And so the third piece is making sure that those who we temporarily invest with our sovereignty operate within that rule of law system. And the final piece of our work is recognizing that we didn't get to this crisis just mysteriously, magically, and spontaneously. We got here through a period of erosion of the systems of our democracy that have just not kept up with modern times. The system has been failing for some time. And so if we are going to meet this crisis with what is required, we also need to see it as an opportunity to update our system. And so the fourth piece of our work is engaging in the kind of democracy reforms that you've probably talked a lot about on this podcast. How do we update the software of our democracy to be more resilient, more inclusive, and more perfect in the 21st century?
Right. Well, we definitely plan to get to that last leg in a little bit. But, I really do think that you do incredible work, but a lot of people don't actually know how. And I encounter a lot of grassroots activists, people who are really worried about the state of things right now, wondering, what they can do. To what extent is Protect Democracy, mainly carrying this fight out in the courts, in which case, if you're a lawyer, great. And how much of what you do is stuff that is about trying to engage lots of people? Essentially, what is the sort of your muscles? How have you built them, and how do you use them?
Well, one way I think to think about it is when you look at people who want to build a more authoritarian society, people don't think, so what are your tools? So do you do that just using the law? Do you do that by deploying the troops to the capital city? Do you do that by trying to spread disinformation through the information ecosystem? Do you do that by organizing people? Well, they do it by all of those means. And so it would be, I think, foolish for the pro-democracy forces to limit themselves to one tool of litigation or one tool of grassroots organizing. And so we start from the approach that the authoritarian attack on our system is multi-tooled and multifaceted, and any pro-democratic response must be as well. And so for us, what that means is we use the strategic tools that make the most sense to solve the problems that are bedeviling our democracy. So for example, when it comes to, kind of protecting the public square from injurious conspiracy theories, and we saw this in the aftermath of the 2020 election, where we had leaders in this country accuse public servants, election officials in the state of Georgia, in the state of Arizona, falsely of corrupting our election, of engaging in fraud. Well, there are rules in this country that if you're going to publicly accuse someone of fraud, and you're wrong, and you're wrong about that, well, that's libel. That's defamation.
Yeah.
You can be held accountable in a court of law for that. And so we've represented election workers in Georgia and Arizona against the people who defame them. And that's through litigation to make sure that the rules work. And there are consequences if you're gonna lie in a way that harms people and harms our democracy. But when it comes to protecting elections, we also need to recognize that after 2020 and after January 6th, in an attempt to overthrow the will of the people, it revealed that there were gaps and weaknesses in our system. So one of the things that President Trump did on January 6th was he tried to take advantage of the fact that a very old and poorly written statute called the Electoral Count Act had some vaguenesses in it. Now, they weren't that vague, but they were vague enough that the president was able to convince at least some subset of people that the vice president had the power to simply decide who won the election. Well, that's not really what the statute says, and that's not really accurate. But the fact the statute was poorly written kind of opened up some of those opportunities. And so we realized that we needed to fix that statute and close some of those gaps. And so we drafted a blueprint for reforming the Electoral Count Act. We shared it with senators on both sides of the aisle and ultimately worked with a bipartisan group of 16 senators to pass the Electoral Count Reform Act, which President Biden signed into law, and closed some of the loopholes and weaknesses in the old Electoral Count Act. So, and we've been doing that sort of legislative work, not just in Congress, but in states throughout the country, working with Republican legislators in Arizona to provide provide protections for election officials, and working with both Republican and Democratic elected officials in Pennsylvania to make sure that every voting machine in the state, for example, has a paper trail. And we've used technology. We've built some tools that use public files to try to make sure that Russia, for example, isn't messing with our voter files. We just use public data to analyze it and see if those files have been tinkered with in ways that suggest foreign, malevolent interference. And so there's a whole bunch of tools that we use to try to advance each of those sort of four goals that I laid out at the top.
Yeah, and that's a really great description. I have this memory of also around 2020, you were involved in work to build a little bit of a social infrastructure around Republican election officials in swing states, so that if and when they became, pressured, because they could, decide not to certify a legitimate outcome in those states, that they would do the right thing. I mean, there's, I think that is one of the more unsung examples. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to me that the behind the scenes stuff has to stay behind the scenes in a way. I know it was in your annual report, so I'm not drawing this out of somewhere, but that kind of stuff, I think it's important for people to know that there are folks who are carefully looking for these places where bulwarks can be built, and where a lot of people will do the right thing, but it helps to give them some support, given the type of pressure they're under, the type of intimidation they're getting from the other side.
Absolutely right. And it's also an opportunity for people to participate in those efforts. And so, you mentioned at the top, obviously, I served in the administration of a Democratic president. But when we decided to launch this organization, one of the first things we did was we talked to the scholars who've been studying the rise of these modern autocrats around the world back in late 2016. Most of the scholars were sort of unknown academics. Today, a lot of them have become best-selling authors like Timothy Snyder or Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, perhaps to their chagrin. I think they may prefer that they lived in a healthier democratic world and they could go back to just teaching their lecture courses. But now some people have read their books and know about them. But one of the things that they advised us back then was that the movements that have been successful at beating back these attempted autocratic takeovers of democracies have been cross-ideological movements. They've brought people together across typical political divides, because these issues, as I said at the top, there really shouldn't be about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. Unfortunately, in the United States, they've become that way. But they really should be about people who disagree about what the top marginal tax rate should be, or how robust the social safety net should be, or how we should regulate the energy sector, or provide health care for those who need it. What these issues really are about are how do we resolve all of those disagreements peacefully within a healthy democratic system, and that if you really want to protect that system, you have to bring people together across divides. And so we've done that. And so our organization includes people from the left, people from the right, people from the center, Democrats, Republicans, and it has allowed us, as you know, to look at some of the people going back to 2020 who were in important positions, elected officials or appointed officials running elections that may have been on the right, Republicans, who wanted to do the right thing. But it would help if they had a social infrastructure around them reinforcing it, because the thing that we both know is that human beings are relational animals. And even the best of us is going to have a hard time doing the right thing if it is going to cost us our spouse, our children, our bowling team, our pastor, our neighbors, our community. If all those people disagree with us and are going to turn on us, maybe Mahatma Gandhi does the right thing, but few other people do. But if someone's facing that level of pressure from their own national political party or from the president of their party, and people who they care about in their personal lives say, you got to stand up for the Constitution. You got to stand up for truth. You got to stand up for democracy and do the right thing even when it's hard. That makes it a lot easier for those people. It's still difficult, but it makes it easier and more likely that those people will do the right thing. And so, in particular, a lot of the Republicans that we work with did that for some of the people who are facing that pressure and helped, give them the support they needed. And I say that that's an opportunity for others, because if you're listening to this and in your community, an appointed official, an elected official, a public servant, someone working in elections that's facing the kind of pressures that you see around the country right now, just a little bit of personal outreach saying, hey, I appreciate you. I support what you're doing. I appreciate you're defending the Constitution. You're trying to do the right thing in a difficult circumstance. You can't underestimate how important and powerful that can be as a contribution to our democracy.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, we are having this conversation today on August 28th, a couple days before Labor Day. It's more than 8 months into the second Trump term. How bad do you think the situation is? And what has surprised you most, if anything has surprised you, about all the things that he's doing to try and consolidate power and remake America into something more like an authoritarian regime, completely beholden to him?
Well, I think the situation is particularly bad because I'm not enough of a gambler. And what I mean by that is when we started this about 8-9 years ago, we talked to all the scholars and said, what does it look like when these autocrats try to dismantle democracy? Is there a consistent playbook that you see across the world? To which they said, absolutely. They said all of these autocratic movements, whether they're coming from the left or they're coming from the right, they all do the same 7 things. They politicize independent institutions like law enforcement, the civil service, the military. They spread disinformation. They aggrandize power in the hands of the executive at the expense of other institutions like courts or Congress or the free press or the private sector. They quash dissent. They scapegoat vulnerable groups. They corrupt elections and they stoke violence. And so starting in January 2017, we began warning that those were things we should expect to see happen in the United States. And then, even after Trump left office in 2020, reluctantly, not voluntarily, really, the other thing that they warned about is that oftentimes it's the second coming of the autocrat that's more dangerous. So Viktor Orban, for example, who Trump looks up to and sort of sets as a model, served as prime minister of Hungary from 1998 to 2002 and governed as a relatively normal right-wing leader. He left office in 2002. He lost, blamed it on fraud, spent the intervening 4 years trying to build what he called a central political force field that would keep him and his allies in power for 15 to 20 years, returns to power, and has now been in power for 4 consecutive cycles and has basically rigged the entire Hungarian political playing field. And so it was actually version 2.0 of the autocrat that was more dangerous than version 1.0, and we were warning of that as well. So we warned about what the autocrats would do. We warned the second coming would be worse. And the reason things are really bad is I never placed an actual bet worth a lot of money on that coming true, because if I had, I'd probably be very wealthy right now, but I didn't. So things are pretty bad.
Yeah. Well, what's your, I don't know why I wrote this question down, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, what's your worst fear? What's, as bad as things are now, how much worse do you think we really should be prepared for?
I'm loath to say it because all those other things have come to pass. But, look, I think it's interesting. If you go overseas or you talk to people overseas about what's happening in the United States, they're remarkably clear-eyed about it. Remarkably clear-eyed. They'll tell you point blank, say, oh, we see what's happening there. You have someone who would like to be a dictator, would like to have total control, who doesn't fundamentally believe in democracy, and is essentially laying the groundwork and building the system in which he can do that. He is turning the entire apparatus of the federal government into being personally loyal to him. He's using it to persecute anyone who would oppose him. He is going to make opposition to him functionally illegal. He's going to rig the information ecosystem and the media landscape so that they know that they need to, pay homage to him and not be critical of him. He will, if necessary, and he's already doing this, deploy the military to the American streets, particularly to the capital city and to other opposition strongholds like other blue cities in order to keep those people under control, and will not respect the result of an election, and certainly will not respect the constraints of things like the 22nd Amendment. And if he has the opportunity to tell the courts to go pound sand and ignore them, he's laying the groundwork to do that as well. They see it perfectly clearly from overseas. It's only here in the United States, I think, because we're so in the heart of it, that I think psychologically it's so difficult to stare at that sun that we are predisposed in a self-protective way to look away,
Yeah.
to try to see it as something else. And so you hear, you and I both, really smart people who are reading everything that's going on and try to come up with some other way of seeing it. Ezra Klein, who's I think a great journalist, does this. He has a piece. We're recording this on the 28th. He had a piece, I think it came out either this morning or yesterday morning, talking about how he interviews Radley Balco and talks about how Trump is building sort of a paramilitary loyal entirely to him. And the opening of the piece, I'm deeply sympathetic to this, offers another way of looking at it. And Ezra basically admits he's often trying to say, well, wait a minute, I could look at it in this way, I could look at it in that way. And I think here in the United States, we're all doing that as a coping mechanism, trying to say, well, maybe there's another way of seeing it because it would feel a lot better if it wasn't what the people overseas see. But they see it clearly, and unfortunately, I think they are right. They have their perspective and distance.
Well,
Trump is trying to build a one-person autocracy.
Sure. Okay. Hair on fire. But where do you see bright signs? Because you guys, Protect Democracy has been in the lead in clarifying what the authoritarian playbook is. We're seeing it play out. We have seen some of civil society cave in ways that they didn't do 8 years ago, whether in, the big media companies, the law firms, certainly many of them. Do you see any bright signs here? I mean, where the people are marshaling the resources that they have, the institutions that do have some power, some capability to push back. Trump does seem to back down when confronted by strong opposition. The markets started to crash. He changed his mind on tariffs. He got a letter from 10 Republican senators who were upset that billions that were supposed to go to education funding had been sequestered at the last minute. They turned around and decided to release that money. He's had some complaints about, the roundup of immigrants who work on farms or in the restaurant industry. He's sort of dancing around whether they're going to let those people have a little, leave them to the side. So are any of these things signs of the kind of sensible opposition that you're trying to build? Do you see that?
You want good news. You want some good news. Don't worry.
It's not so much that I say this because, and I write about this all the time too, I see a lot of catastrophizing where people, we go, we've all seen bad movies about fascism or read the books. And, there is a degree to where if you convince yourself that it's an unstoppable force, you won't try. And yet the future is unwritten. So, telling people it's bleak can often make them do nothing.
You wouldn't know it from the first half of this conversation, but I'm an optimist. So let's pivot a little bit there, and let me tell you why. So look, I described that sort of 7-step authoritarian playbook before. But one thing about it is those different tactics that the autocrats use, they don't work in isolation from each other. They operate as sort of a spinning wheel together, right? Where the autocrat uses the powers of government, consolidates the power to retaliate against perceived opponents. That creates a climate of fear. People step back, including those in the institutions that are supposed to check power, because little secret, institutions are not marble buildings fronted by ionic columns. They're people, right? The Supreme Court ain't nothing without people inside. But when people get afraid, they step back. There's no check on power. Power consolidates. And that kind of works in the sort of vicious spiral. And where you see democracy movements prevail, what they do is they reverse that spiral, right? And they do that by landing kind of an initial set of pro-democracy actors kind of on the beachhead, right? The people who first land in Normandy, right? And those are tip of the spear actors. They're groups like Protect Democracy and a lot of our peers in the field who are out there litigating, organizing protests, people to show up at town halls. And what those actors do is they pierce the veil of invincibility and inevitability, as you note.
Yeah.
And they provide space in which a broader group of actors, maybe not the most aggressive pro-democracy actors, people who are more kind of part of mainstream American society who don't do this for a living, then feel the water is warm enough that they can get in and form coalitions across divides. And when that happens, the veil of fear starts to lift. And the people and institutions then all of a sudden feel empowered to uphold their oaths and check power, and autocratic power is disrupted. And I think one way you can look at the first, 7-8 months of this presidential term is that there have been periods when that spiral is going downwards, and there have been periods when it's actually been going in the positive direction. So for the first 2 months, the sort of shock and awe, flood the zone, whisk people off to El Salvador without due process and tell the courts to pound sand, the spiral was going in a bad direction. You could feel the fear set in. But then, as you noted, there was this moment, Liberation Day, where Trump blinks. Right. The bond markets recoil at the tariff announcement. He steps back. He backs down initially on his pledge to fire Jerome Powell for similar reasons. And then a bunch of court victories kind of pierce the veil of inevitability, and you could almost feel that fear lift. And it's in that moment that 7 Republican senators oppose the nominee for U.S. Attorney in D.C. It's at that moment the Supreme Court goes from a 5-4 ruling against Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act to a 7-2 ruling, right? The institutions start to step forward. But Trump, he's hip to this, right? So he knows that the cycle's starting to move in the other direction. And it was at that moment that he realized he needed to reassert control. And that's when he deployed the troops to LA, right? And so you see this cycle spin in both directions, and it will spin back, right? There was a special election in Iowa earlier this week where the Democrats flipped a seat that Trump won by 11 points. They swung at about 20 points. If you look actually at all the special elections that have taken place over the last several months, Democrats are winning those special elections by about a 16-point average over the 2024 results. The polling is a bit all over the map. Trump's underwater on a bunch of subject matter issues, but on overall approval, it really depends on which pollster you look at. But special elections can be signal that noise, and they've been resoundingly suggesting the public is very much unhappy with the direction the president's in, because even though the public really does want profound change in this country, they don't want autocracy. And some of the stuff that Trump's doing is profoundly unpopular, and I think in that is something to be quite optimistic about, which is the American public don't want a lot of what Trump is offering.
Yeah, I would add to that, and people who sit on grand juries, especially in blue cities like Washington, D.C., don't seem willing to just let the prosecutors throw the book at people because they threw a sandwich at an ICE agent or, that sort of thing. We're seeing some, I wouldn't call it jury nullification, but independent thinking by people realizing that they don't have to give a blank check in those moments.
What's particularly inspiring about that example, Micah, is the founders envisioned a system of checks and balances, and the elite checks, Congress, the courts, the private sector, the fourth estate in a lot of ways are not working. But the ultimate checks the founders put in there, the jury system and the voters, the we the people check, it is working.
That's really great. So I wanted to make sure we got to this before we finished, because it's one of the legs of your work, and it's also something I know I've heard you say in other forums, that those of us who were trying to protect democracy from incipient authoritarianism in 2024 got caught in a kind of trap where our defense of the institution sounded like too many voters, like just a defense of the status quo. And we know that a large majority of the public is not happy with the political status quo. When you ask people, if they think the two-party system is working for them, 60% or more say they want more choices. You see supermajority saying they want a complete overhaul or a transformation of the system. So I know Protect Democracy has decided to devote a portion of its resources and time to that idea that whatever we do when we get out of this, we're not just going back to the old way of doing things. So can you say some more about that? What are you working on? What do you see as the kinds of approaches that we need to take, and where might we see some early signs of progress? on that.
Well, the first thing I would say is that in the before times, in the before 2016 times, you and I both worked in a field that would be referred to as government reform. That's what it was called, right? We wanted to reform the campaign finance system, get money out of politics. We wanted to improve voting rights, ethics and transparency reforms. We were the reform world because we thought the system was unfair. We thought the system was really not working the way it was supposed to. 2016 comes along, and this charismatic demagogue says, yeah, the system's totally broken. We should blow the whole thing up and give me all the power. And I think a lot of us working in the reform world went, whoa, ho, wait a minute. That's not what we're talking about. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need some reforms, but don't blow the whole dang thing up. And we inadvertently in that moment went from the reformers to the protectors of the system. And the public was with us. We were right. The system wasn't working. And all of a sudden, we were jogging in that race, and Trump just ran right past us and snatched the torch of reform. He didn't call it reform. He just basically called it revolution. And we got to get it back. We got to get it back because we were right all along. The system really did need fixing. It wasn't working. It wasn't delivering for people. 81% of Americans, from Democrat, Independent, Republicans, say our entire political system needs a revamp. So one of the things that we're working on is our electoral system creates incentives for Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy to behave in the anti-democratic ways that they're behaving. The first past the post system of binary two parties, the gerrymandering system, one person wins, even if they win 51-49. So 49% of that district, it's zero representation whatsoever. And so it's a winner take all. If I don't get 51%, I get zilch. So why would I compromise? I'll just serve my 51%. So you get situations where Donald Trump says, California didn't vote for me, so if they burn down from wildfires, not my problem. I don't need them to win the Electoral College, right? There's a whole bunch of incentives that are actually causing bad behavior. And most of the advanced democracies around the world have learned this. They don't use the single-member district, first-past-the-post system that we inherited, from England of the 1700s and 1600s. Most advanced democracies around the world have updated their software in the last 60, 70 years. They have much more proportional systems that use proportional representation. They use multi-member districts. They have multiple parties, multi-partyism. These sorts of dynamic systems create better responsiveness, better representation. They serve as a better check against extremism and authoritarianism. And we need to move to some of those through things like re-legalizing fusion voting, which is what we partner with the Center for Ballot Freedom on, which is to give voters more choices of different parties without throwing their vote away for some spoiler third party that has no chance of winning. Or starting to experiment more with proportional representation systems and multi-member districts. Right now, Massachusetts has about 35% Republicans, 0 Republicans in the state legislature, in the congressional delegation. Oklahoma is the reverse. About the third Democrats, no representatives. That creates a distrust in the system where people don't feel represented. And there are ways to fix it. We've seen it around the world, and we should be starting to experiment with that here.
So the work Protect Democracy has been doing is both, on this front, it's legal and it's also sort of intellectual spade work. There's a lot of good stuff on your website about educating people about these options, whether it's fusion or proportional representation. So that's where you're investing. You see those as the path forward, and it's interesting because they also, it's as you were describing it, you were appealing to both sides of the political spectrum. That there are places where people in the minority party are definitely getting the shaft, Oklahoma and Massachusetts. So that's why this type of change is there. But this is post 2028 in all likelihood, except for the lawsuits.
Not necessarily. The fusion. Yeah. So fusion voting, just so that folks know, is a practice that was the dominant prevalent practice in America prior to the early 20th century, and it was a system in which multiple parties could form, and they could all nominate the same candidate. So if you were an abolitionist, for example, in the North in the 1850s, well, you didn't want to be a Democrat because the Democrats were pro-slavery in the South, but you didn't really want to be a Whig either because the Whigs weren't anti-slavery. They ran pro-slavery candidates in the South. So you joined the Liberty Party or you joined the Free Soil Party, and you said to the Whig nominee, say Salmon Chase in Ohio or Charles Sumner in Massachusetts, if you will adopt our anti-slavery positions, all 50,000 people that are members of our Liberty Party will vote for you on the Liberty Party ticket. And that was legal all over the country. It actually helped create the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln wins in 1860 on a fusion ticket. And then the Republicans ban it across the North and the Democrats ban it across the South because, as they say, we don't want to fight with multiple parties.
A few decades later, but yes.
2 decades later.
Right.
It stays legal in New York and Connecticut, and it's illegal in 48 other states in violation of people's right to freedom of association. So we are currently representing some plaintiffs challenging those bans in New Jersey and in Kansas and in Wisconsin. And we're looking to the state Supreme Courts there to vindicate people's right to associate freely with who they want in the political system.
Right, right. And there may be more court cases to come. So this is something that people should watch for. We may get some openings and get us out of the two-party doom loop that way. Well, listen, this has been great. I really appreciate you giving us a smidge of your time. I have a final question, and this is one that I've asked all of our guests, a little more of a personal question. These are such dark and challenging times. So how do you cope? What enables you to keep going in the face of this?
I was reflecting especially on this question the last couple of days because I do think it's been a particularly darkened year recently with the deployment of troops to Washington and the sort of weaponization of our law enforcement system and some of the real dangerous threats out there. And I found myself, I think there's two secular religions in the movement world. There's the Star Wars people and there's the Lord of the Rings people. I'm a Star Wars person, right? I'm an Andor person. I'm a Force person. But I actually found myself going to the Lord of the Rings on this because there's an idea that Tolkien introduces in the Lord of the Rings called the long defeat. And it's a concept about, in his view, in Tolkien's view, that history bends towards entropy, but that doesn't change our obligation to do the right, moral, just thing in our moment. And that in doing that, regardless of the outcome, there's dignity and there's beauty and there's hope. And that's our obligation. And I happen to think that history doesn't bend towards entropy. I'm more on the Martin Luther King Jr. side of things there. But I think that because we all fall on different sides of the optimism-pessimism spectrum, there's something beautiful about this idea of the hard-earned hope of the long defeat, which is it doesn't matter what you think the future holds. There's some dignity and beauty and rightness in doing the good and right thing right now. And you can hold to that. And I published a piece this week in our Substack, if you can keep it, which maybe we can link to when we post this,
highly
on this
recommended.
idea. On this idea of the hard-earned hope of the long defeat. I don't think we're destined to the long defeat, but I do think there's great strength in holding to that idea that there's a right thing to do right now, and we can find dignity in that. Okay,
so what we have to do as we play out this segment is find the music for when they light the signal fires, and and they light up across the mountains, and the music swells, and we realize that we are being called to battle. But it's a noble battle, and in that there's I hear you on that. That's great, Ian. Thank you.
But for fusion's sake, we'll cue John Williams in the Star Wars theme song there.
Okay. Very good. Well, that's it for this episode of This Old Democracy. If you found today's conversation thought-provoking, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our work and our partners at the Center for Ballot Freedom, go to centerforballotfreedom.org. I'm Micah Sifry, and I'll be back soon with more conversations with people who are fighting to renew and repair and rebuild this old democracy because it's ours and it's worth saving. Thanks for listening and stay engaged.